Continuing my faction tier list for Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, we get to Slaneesh. And I think in terms of strength ranking, Slaneesh is a solid enough B tier, maybe even lower really. The problem for Slaneesh is, one, you are dependent on having the Champions of Chaos DLC to actually have an endgame army that's worth anything, because the problem with the baseline Slaneeshi units is they can do a lot of damage, but they just don't have a good deal of durability. And many of them are demons, so when they start dying, they just completely evaporate. They don't rout. Units being able to rout out the battlefield is a significant benefit in a campaign, if you can win the battle, of course. If you can lose, sure, there's pros and cons with that approach, but it helps keep your units alive. One of the problems Slaneesh has is Slaneesh units, with the exception of like things like Forsaken of Slaneesh, Warriors of Chaos of Slaneesh, Chosen of Slaneesh, they just don't have the durability. So you are going to rely on the DLC for that. Now, Slaneesh has a significant amount of power in terms of the economy, especially through vassals, and Slaneesh can vassalize quite a few factions through diplomacy, through the unique diplomacy benefits that Slaneesh does have, and you can ultimately get a powerful army, powerful economy, a lot of vassals. You can vassalize Elfarian, Alariel, Tyrion relatively quickly in your campaign. Like, let's say the first 20 turns of Slaneesh are brutal, but it is actually a lot of fun to play it. And once you do, you are a dominant faction on the campaign map in ways that very few other factions can dream of, with the exception of the Warriors of Chaos themselves, to be sure. Which I'm not going to include in this video, by the way, the Warriors of Chaos, the Wood Elves, because they would all be S tier. Just going to mention that from the very beginning here. I'm going to do a separate video for them later on. But yeah, Slaneesh, a solid B tier. Then we get to the Skaven. The Ratmen have cometh. Clan Moors, solid A tier. Strong starting position, decent enough action benefits, a powerful duelist as a lord. Just all around, very solid faction to play as a baseline Skaven faction. Queek is just a monster in battles. While he doesn't have the same benefits as the DLC Legendary Lords, he does have a great starting position where he can take basically 3 entire provinces with only minor opposition. The major opposition is going to come in from the dwarves, but even then, it's not really going to be a significant opposition. And Skarbrand is going to secure your southern flank for a decent level of time. Later on, of course, threats to build up, Forek, Khalida, others, absolutely sure. But having that early game start, being able to take 3-4 province, including Carricade Peaks, does give you a significant amount of faction benefits in your campaign that you can fully utilize. And while Queek is certainly the generic legendary lord of the Skaven, he does work, because the Skaven are a very solid race and very strong race. Then we get into Clan Eshin, Deathmaster Tzeentch, absolutely an S tier, good starting position, good faction effects, lots of possibilities on the campaign map, even in terms of diplomacy with Tzeentch. Like, Tzeentch is as close as you can get to a diplomatic powerhouse for a Skaven, just because he gets vision with other Skaven factions, and he can potentially confederate those other Skaven factions. So hey, you want to get Fraught, you want to get Skrulk, you want to get Queek, you want to get Ikaclaw, Tzeentch is going to be able to do that the easiest. Besides that, with his schemes, he might just be able to eliminate entire faction leaders, or basically entire factions from the campaign map, and then gobble up their territory. So, significant amount of campaign power, good starting position. In many ways, it's a fun campaign. Cafe is generally a really great place to have a campaign, regardless of the Legendary Lord we're talking about. And Tzeentch certainly takes advantage of that situation. His only downside is that non-Eshin units are far more expensive initially, but you can then lower the costs and even get a significant discount, actually. Though you are going to have to work for it, so it's going to take some time to be able to build up towards that. Ikaclaw, solid enough A tier. The faction effects are good. The problem, two significant problems. One, your early game is slow, and it's limited, because you start in a situation where you got the Wood Elves, you got Belegar, you got Sartosa, you got Mogr, and each and every single one of those can very likely declare war on you. It's not that you're going to lose Skaven Blight. Losing Skaven Blight, like, if you manage to screw that up, then honestly, that is exceptional. That is an exceptional failure, but it's more so the limitations that those factions impose on the territory you can conquer. You can make it work, but it does take some doing that imposes limitations on his campaign. And then you have the focus that Ikeclaw has in his campaign. His focus, beyond nuclear weapons, is on rallying gunners and Jezzails, right? Those gunpowder units. And while you can certainly make an army of those work, it is going to be in limited numbers. It is going to have some hard limitations. In Warhammer 2, he was far more powerful, but the way ranged units work in Warhammer 3 versus 2 is far differently. Like, range has been nerfed, and not just in terms of their damage capabilities, it's also down to how range works. Like, range units are far less likely to shoot, to fire, especially gunpowder units, which creates a lot of problems for Ikeclaw in particular. I mean, he already had some issues, like in particular in sieges with Jezzails and rattling gunners. It is worse in Warhammer 3 in that respect. So that's the reason I'm not giving Ikeclaw, like, his starting position is limiting him. The units he focuses on do limit him, but there is a significant amount of power. And then there's Tzeentch. Is Tzeentch even a legendary lord? Well, he is. The problem is Tzeentch is focusing on units that you never want to use in any campaign, including his. He is the Storm Vermin master, but the thing about Storm Vermin is they are genuinely not worth recruiting in any campaign. You do want to get the structure for chieftains, right? For a chieftain capacity, you do want to get the building chain, but you don't want to bother with Storm Vermin. Too expensive, not so useful in combat. There are much better units, including melee units, that you can use in a Skaven campaign besides Storm Vermin. So it's just like a playstyle just doesn't end up working. He's not completely horrible. He's still a Skaven Legendary Lord, but it's the Skaven equivalent of playing Ungrim, where the units he's focusing on are not units you want to use, and the benefits are not so great that you'd bother changing that, so you're effectively playing a generic lord with no real faction benefits in a lot of ways. Except the War Declaration one, which stacks, so you can basically have that throughout your entire campaign, but honestly, when I consider the nuclear weapons, the assassins that Tzeentch has, and even Quake's combat ability, Tzeentch falls behind by a significant amount. Then we get Clan Molder. I was tempted to put Clan Molder as an S tier, but really, Clan Molder, the problem with Clan Molder is that their early game is not great. They will face severe limitations in the early game. Fraud's power comes from the mid-late game. So that's when he becomes really powerful, really ridiculous, with a lot of customized armies and significant amount of power. He focuses on the beasts of the Skaven. And there is certainly a playstyle that does work there, and he makes it work far better. Also, he has significant and unique unit customization for every single one of his units in his armies, if you get enough materials for that. But he does start in Kislev, and Kislev, despite the terrain improvements, still isn't a great part of the map to have a campaign in. If you overcome that, once you manage to overcome that, it does become far better, but it's more like the mid-late game benefit. The early game is still not that great to deal with. And it's not that it's that hard, it's more so that it imposes a limitation. It prevents you from steamrolling in the same way many other campaigns can do. And then we have Skrulk. I know I'm putting a lot of factions in A tier over here, sure, but ultimately, Skrulk is actually a far better legendary lord than you might think. He has a decent starting position. He has a decent enough army. His playstyle does work. I would even argue Skrulk starts with the best starting army of all the Skaven. Well, you can make the argument for Slaneesh, of course, right? But the artillery, the plague laws that Skrulk does have, and his only real opposition is going to come in the form of Gorok. Tenowin is just a speed bump for Skrulk in a significant number of ways, and once you eliminate him, is game over, more or less. Also, Skrulk, uniquely among the Skaven, he actually does have other Skaven allies, or at least one ally that he can work with in his campaign, so you can have someone helping out. You can also make an alliance with the Vampire Coast, you can make an alliance with Rakarth if you so desire, but ultimately, Skrulk is fairly decent. And this is in the context where he isn't necessarily that special. Yes, he focuses on plague monks and he focuses on plagues. And the Skaven plague should never be underestimated because it is a damn dangerous thing to use in a campaign. I would argue it's the strongest plague, even if it has a more limited duration effect, if you will. But the damage the Skaven plague can cause is fairly significant, far better than Nurgle ones at the very least. Then we get into Tzeentch, Kairos Fateweaver, an F-tier faction. A good legendary lord in terms of combat and magical combat ability, but just severe limitations. Tzeentch has a major issue of replenishment, far more so than the vast majority of other factions in the game. And that is one of the things you're going to struggle in a Kairos campaign. Like, You can see with the Changeling campaign how if Tzeentch has good replenishment, they steamroll. You can see with the Warriors of Chaos, the same situation. Kairos just can't do that, and his economy is fairly limited, and it only works if you get a lot of structures that boost the income percent you're getting for settlements. So you need a lot of territory to really get going. It can work, you can vassalize if you have powerful magic, but the limitations on replenishment, the limitations on economy, not being able to trade, significant issues that come out of that. Like, Nakari has far more economic potential than Kairos has. And while both Nakari and Kairos have issues of replenishment, I would argue that replenishment issue actually end up being worse with Kairos. Then we have the Changeling, an S-tier faction in terms of strength. You can't lose a campaign as the Changeling. Like, in point of fact, like in terms of pure strength, like S-tier plus easily for the Changeling. He is without a doubt the strongest legendary lord. You can't lose a campaign. You don't hold territory. You screw over other factions. Your armies are are highly unlikely to be defeated. Even if they are, you're just going to recover from that. He is an overpowered legendary lord in every way that counts. Not really a fun campaign to play, but certainly a very powerful legendary lord to play as. Then we have the Tomb Kings. Cetra is a C-tier legendary lord. It is an unfortunate situation in Cetra's campaign. He is limited by territory, he is limited by the opponents, he's limited by the fact he can only recruit one army for a very long period of time. So all of those things do stack up and do severely limit Cetra's campaign. And by the point you're steamrolling, you've kind of won the campaign already. So you have a significant amount of challenge to deal with. You don't have really the tools to deal with them. Because even the army you're going to have is not really going to be that great compared to what your neighbors can recruit far more easily, and they'll have multiple armies to throw against you. So Cetra does have some significant issues to deal with. I think the Tomb Kings would be in a far better place and a far better spot on this list. Like, they would jump to A tier if they could just recruit a second army from the beginning of the campaign, but they can't. So severe limitations because of that. Khalida is in the same boat. She has a better starting position, but she does face all the same limitations that Cetra has. She may also have to fight Forik, which is never an easy task, especially when you only have one army. Though you can also make a deal with Forik, dependent on how you play your cards. Though, given your campaign objectives, you don't want to wipe him out. The Bucks and Nagash in particular. So not the great situation to be dealing with as Khalida in a lot of ways. Then there's Kotep. Kotep is a weird one. Kotep is a good lord, actually. He's far stronger. Like, in terms of, like, strength, yeah, he could easily be, like, A tier in quite a few ways, or at least B. Because his starting position is easy enough. His situation is not difficult. He can pick his fights, choose who he's going to fight, when he's going to fight them. The problem is, and he has quite a few heroes that he can get early on. And he has an artillery piece as a mount option. That's a ridiculous amount of strength. The problem is that Kotep is one of those campaigns that is flat out ruined by the campaign starting situation. I think if it was a Horde army, that would be better, but the fact that he literally starts on the other side of the planet and he has to make his way back to Khemri through a bunch of unsuitable climate, it nerfs his campaign potential in an enormous way, in a way very few other Legendary Lords can compare. I would say he's genuinely the only Legendary Lord that is strong, but screwed over by their starting position and by climate. That is Kotep's situation in a nutshell. So yeah, an F-tier Legendary, an F-tier faction there. Then we get into Archon the Black. Archon the Black is an A-tier because, yeah, fun fact, he does start with 2 armies. And on top of that, he has a very strong defensible starting position in his campaign. And he has access to more unit types, so you can actually get armies that aren't skeletal warriors or spearmen. So he actually has some quality troops in his early game armies. So the Archon ends up being far stronger than all the other Tomb King Legendary Lords because of that. And he has the same advantages, like you can vassalize factions with diplomacy as the Tomb King, so just trade away some crucial territory, they'll bend the knee. So he ends up being fairly strong in diplomacy. He ends up being fairly strong in battles, the strongest of the Legendary Lords of the Tomb Kings, because it doesn't matter how strong Khalida's army or Cetra's army or Kotep's armies can be when Archon can bring twice as many troops easily. And that's from the start of the campaign, to mention that. So Archon, I would strongly argue he's an A-tier lord. Cetra has more late game benefits in the sense of like growth, construction time, all that. But Archon just ends up steamrolling from turn 1. He literally starts with an entire province, because he just auto-resolves the minor Bretonnian faction he starts a war with, and then he just wipes out Rapans very easily, and then, yeah, he can do whatever the hell he wants after that particular point. And he can make a network of alliances to secure his territory even further, including with the dwarves that start just directly north of him, north of his capital. Then we get into the vampire counts. Kemmler is certainly a B-tier legendary lord. I think he is quite decent, but he is going to have some complications because, well, all of Bretonnia does hate him. You can make it work, don't get me wrong. Vampire counts are not a bad faction. You can make it work. You can end up taking all of Bretonnia relatively quickly in short order. And you will not face the threat of Be'lakor in your campaign, unlike Lewin. And the factions that you're going to end up in a war with are the kind of factions that you can steamroll. Like the Empire, yeah, it's you know, it's just a speed bump. The entire Empire is just a speed bump in your path. The Wood Elves are a different discussion, but you can avoid taking territory next to them for a while at least, and then end up dominating. You have a powerful caster who can summon a powerful lord, melee lord, and battles as well. So you get 2 lords for the price of 1. There's a significant amount of strength with that. Manfred, C tier, he lacks the skill line, he lacks the faction effects to be great. He starts surrounded by factions, all of which, except Archon, who's not going to help him all that much either, he starts surrounded by factions that hate him. And the way he's designed is around the idea that Manfred is going to gain the similar effects that you would have with faction effects, or a skill line that affects the faction as a whole. He would get those from the Books of Nagash. But that is a long and arduous journey, so I really can't recommend Manfred as a great legendary lord for the vampire counts. Then we get into Gorst. Gorst is... I hate his campaign, I hate his playstyle, but he is an S-tier legendary lord. He makes really cheap armies of zombies that can fight even endgame units to a standstill, if not outright winning, against the vast majority of threats that he has in the campaign. And we're talking here incredibly cheap. Let's say other factions might be spending 3k plus to compete with Gorst's zombies. And Gorst doesn't just have to use zombies. You can use zombies as part of an army, but you can get Graveguard, you can get all the powerful units the vampire counts do have, and throw in a huge number of zombies to be meat shields that have teeth in his case. His faction effects are ridiculous. His zombies are very difficult to kill. He hard counters the other factions that are near him, with the exception of Cafe, and he can hold his own quite well against Yao Ming in particular. And he does have a lot of territorial potential in his campaign as well. So while I wouldn't recommend playing Gorst's campaign, he is certainly a very powerful legendary lord. That is not something that I think can be argued. And that leaves Vlad and Isabella. I think Vlad and Isabella are an A-tier, both of them. There are 2 legendary lords in one army. Both of them, like the crazy thing about this is you get special skill lines for both of them, regardless of who you play. So if you start as Isabella, which is the stronger choice, like I'm really counting Isabella as an A-tier here, then Vlad will still have his skill line, and on top of that, he will start with both of his items, because the legendary lord you pick, that's the one you're going to have to do the quest for, but the other one will start with both of their items. And that means Vlad has his ring from the beginning of a campaign, and his sword. So it ends up being quite ridiculous. Like, Vlad in particular is so strong that he can realistically solo entire armies on his own. That is how ridiculously powerful he is. And then you have all the other benefits that the vampire counts do have. The Empire is a cakewalk. Ungrim might be the biggest issue. Ungrim, Drika, and Azak, but you can win those fights against every single one of them. Just don't get entangled against Drika too early on. Wait for her to start a war with Azak and then pounce on that. And that just leaves the vampire host over here. I'm going to put it like this. The Vampire Coast, every single one of their legendary lords is an F, with the exception of Arnessa. They are all F tier legendary lords, and it's not even the faction effects. It's not their situation, their starting situation, their territory, or anything like that. It's just the fact the Vampire Coast doesn't really have an army worth a damn. Like, with the exception of artillery, all in some in-game units that are incredibly expensive and your economy won't be able to support, all of the units they have in their campaign are utter rubbish. Again, with the exception of like some tier 4, tier 5 units. Sure, Depth Guard are good, but that's it. You are just severely limited in the campaign because of that. So the Vampire Coast is a joke of a race, and all of their legendary lords are F tier, with the major exception of Arnessa. Now, when I make these lists, I assume I'm counting DLC. This list will look completely different if we weren't counting DLC, right? So Arnessa, she gets to, she's not necessarily that much better, to be clear. She's D tier. But what makes her better is that, one, she starts with the ability of recruiting Sartosa-free companies. You want units that are actually worth something in the early game, and you can use them throughout your entire campaign. She does have them. They're not especially great units. They're kind of like nasty skulkers, if you will, though a weaker version. Or cutthroats from, like, yeah, cutthroats are a good choice. Like, Sartosa-free company are tier 1 unit that can compare to the cutthroats that the cast dwarfs have. That means you have an army that is decent enough in the early game. Not great, but decent enough, unlike the others who, again, have no units worth of them and can easily lose their units. The leadership is low, the armor is low, they're going to crumble into dust very, very quickly. Arnessa has units that can stand the fight. That's significant for her. On top of that, she starts in a fairly secure position in Sartosa itself. Yes, she does have a complication that she shares with Belegar, Ikekla, and all that. In that, yeah, you're surrounded by factions that want to kill you, and you don't want to expand too far north because the endgame crisis of Athel-Loren is waiting for you there. But you can go against Rapunzel and take that territory, and you're in a good position to be able to do so. And once you've taken that territory, once you've secured that, and you've gotten to a decent enough tier, you can recruit man-eaters. And the thing about man-eaters, they actually work quite well to complement her Sartosa Free Company. Throw in a smattering of man-eaters, combined with Sartosa Free Company, you actually have a fucking army over there that's pretty solid. Like, this is the thing it's infuriating of the ogres. The ogres have good units, but they just can't access them really in a campaign, whereas if you're playing Arnessa, you can get better units for the ogres than actual ogres can get in their campaigns. She's like, if you want to play the ogre tide, Arnessa is a much better choice. She still has severe limitations because of the way that the hero capacity is designed for Vampire Coast, the way their economy works. You do want to set up Pyre Coves and all that kind of stuff. So it's still not a great situation, to be clear, that she has, but she is better than all the rest. And that, of course, just leaves the Wood Elves and the Warriors of Chaos. Long story short, if I were to put every single one of these factions, they would all be S tier, without discussion. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make a separate video. This was, by the way, not the plan for this. Like, I thought originally I was just going to make one video and that was going to be it. But I do have a lot of things to say. There's a lot of nuance. Yes, a lot of races ended up having legendary lords on the same tier, but there are nuances as to why they are there. Like, just because Queek and Ikekla are both A tier doesn't mean they're the same. They're not. They play very differently. They have different focuses in their campaign, different situations. But that is my perspective on the faction strength in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. I know people say, oh, you like the Dark Elves so much. Well, they're all incredibly strong. I think people underestimate how strong Hellebron is, for instance. Now, some people would say, well, Malekith should be put B tier and not A tier, and Hellebron be put in the A tier slot. That is something I can agree with, but he's still a Dark Elf Legendary Lord, and he does start with the port, ultimately. And you do have a lot of economic potential, faction potential from the very, very start. And that would be it. Stay tuned for more. Costin signing out, and I might even do a list. I'm planning on doing a list, actually, of which factions do I think are the best to actually play. There are obviously going to be a lot of similarities over here, but ultimately there are also going to be differences as well. significant ones. Because, for instance, I would never put the Changeling as an S-tier faction in terms of, like, actually playing him. Because he's awful to actually play. And also, Wood Elves, Warriors of Chaos, who I said all of them deserve S-tier, I would also put F-tier, every single one of them. Like, Dryka, maybe she'd squeak by with the D because she's kind of fun to play, or at least early on, but just not a great situation for them. Like, the Changeling, Wood Elves, Warriors cast, they just steamroll the campaign maps to such a degree that there's no challenge, there's no thought put into it, there's nothing interesting happening there. You just take your army, kill everything aside, and there's no empire to manage. That's the thing. Like, you can say, well, other factions have the situation where they steamroll. Yes, but they do have to manage empire. They have to take those decisions, like risk reward, like where do you attack, how do you advance, all of that. Warriors of Chaos and Wood Elves and the Changeling do not care about that situation. You can make the argument Axiatl, but, well, that's not quite true. Axiatl still wants to take territory. Like, all the factions that you see in S-tier, like that I would personally put in S-tier, would still want to take territory. Anyway, Quasine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.